Hello and welcome back to Brickonomics, the business of building. I'm your host, Nick Scroggs, and today I want to start this episode with a topic that took me longer to understand, probably than it should have. Overhead. Overhead doesn't kill businesses when times are slow. It actually kills businesses during times of growth. That sounds backwards. When things are slow, the fear is obvious. The phone isn't ringing, cash is thin, and every fixed expense feels like a weight. But the fear is visible. You can feel it and you can react to it. Growth is different. Growth feels like validation. The schedule is full, you're hiring, you're expanding, revenue is climbing, and so overhead climbs with it. New staff, more space, more infrastructure, because you need all of that to support the bigger version of the company that you're trying to build. The problem is that overhead commits you before revenue confirms you. The moment you sign a lease, bring on a salaried employee, or add any fixed expenses to your cost structure, you've created an obligation that doesn't care whether your jobs close on time. It doesn't care whether the market softens. It doesn't care whether your production team takes longer to ramp up than you projected. It just runs every month, whether your revenue shows up or not. And what makes this so dangerous in construction specifically is that the gap between committing to overhead and collecting the revenue to cover it can be months, sometimes longer. You build the team in January, you train them through spring, you expect them to be producing at full capacity by summer, and somewhere in that timeline, if the assumptions you've built into the model don't hold, if your production team runs slower, if one large project slips, if a new hire takes 6 months to ramp up instead of 3, the overhead you committed to in January is still running in full. I know this because it's happened to us. Not in a slow year. In fact, it was in one of our most ambitious ones. This episode is about what overhead actually is, how to build it intentionally, and how to monitor it before it quietly consumes everything that you've worked to earn. Let's start with a clean definition because I think a lot of builders use the word overhead without a precise understanding of what belongs there and what doesn't. Overhead is every expense your business incurs, whether or not you have a single job running. If you closed every project tomorrow and had zero active work, what would still cost you money? Your office rent, your salaried staff, your insurance, your software subscriptions, your vehicles, and your executive compensation. All of that runs regardless of production, so that's overhead. Job costs are different. Job costs only exist because a specific project exists. Materials, subcontractors, project specific labor. When the job ends, those costs end with it. We covered the importance of separating these two categories in episode 6 when we talked about job costing, but overhead deserves its own conversation because it behaves differently than job cost in one critical way. Job costs scale with work. Overhead scales with the decisions that you make. Every time you make a commitment, a hire, a lease, a recurring expense, you're adding to a fixed cost base that now has to be covered before you make a single dollar of profit. And the larger that base gets, the more revenue you need just to break even. When I look at our overhead structure, I organize it into 5 specific categories. Advertising, what you spend to generate leads and maintain visibility. Sales commissions, the cost of converting those leads into signed contracts. Office expense, staff, rent, utilities, technology, and the administrative infrastructure that keeps the company running. And then job expenses, vehicles, supervision costs of job specific labor, tools, equipment, and service and callbacks. These sit in overhead because they support the business broadly, even though they're operationally connected to fieldwork. And finally, general expenses, executive compensation, insurance, banking costs, taxes, legal fees, accounting, education and training, entertainment, recruiting, and association dues. Now, here's the insight that matters most when you look at that list. These categories don't all behave the same way. Some scale naturally with revenue. Commissions go up when sales goes up. Recruiting costs rise when you're growing your headcount. Those are somewhat self-regulating. Some are essentially fixed. Rent, salaries, insurance. They don't move that much regardless of what revenue does. And a small but important group are discretionary. Education and training, dues and subscriptions, entertainment. These don't scale down automatically when revenue misses, but they can be reduced intentionally when you need to find flex in the budget. Understanding which bucket each expenses live in is what gives you the ability to manage overhead actively instead of just reporting it after the fact. I'm going to tell you about a year that was supposed to be a breakthrough year for us. By our fifth year in business, we had strung together several years of significant revenue growth. We had built real systems. We had a team, we had momentum. And when we sat down to do our annual projections, everything pointed to another strong year, potentially our biggest yet. So that's what we planned for. We built our overhead budget around an ambitious revenue projection. We brought on new production staff to support the volume we expected to deliver. We invested in the infrastructure of a bigger company because we believed reasonably that the growth was coming, and we had spent the past several years doing the exact opposite, growing our staff only after they had been pushed to their limits. And here's the part that makes this story different from the typical cautionary tale. We actually had the work. This was not a sales problem. Our backlog was full. The contracts were already signed. The projects were real. By every external measure, we were set up for the year that we had planned. What we didn't plan for is what happened on the inside. The new production staff that we had hired to support the growth, we had projected them at full productivity from day one. We assumed that because we had the processes, the systems, and the experience, that new people would step in and immediately perform at the level of the team members that they were joining. That's just not how it works. What actually ended up happening is that those new hires spent the majority of their year at roughly 50% of what a fully trained, fully comfortable team member could produce. They were learning our processes. They were building relationships with our trade partners. They were getting comfortable with our standards, our communication style, our expectations. All of that takes time. And while they were ramping, the experienced members of our team were absorbing the mentoring load, which meant that their output was compressed too. So, what we had projected as a fully productive team was, in reality, a partially productive team for most of the year. And the revenue followed. By mid year, we could see that we were behind that projection, but instead of treating that gap as a signal to act, we treated it as a temporary condition. We told ourselves we would make it up in the second half. We stayed optimistic. We kept spending at the projected rate because we still believed that the year would come together. It didn't. We ended that year nearly $1 million short of our revenue projection. Because we had budgeted overhead at the projected revenue level and spent it at that level, and because we never made a mid year adjustment, we had burned through the overhead budget of a bigger company while operating as a smaller one. The profitability for the entire year was gone. Not because the market turned on us, not because we lost clients, not because the work wasn't there, but because the overhead structure that we had committed to was built for a version of our company that didn't fully exist yet, and we weren't watching closely enough to catch it while there was still time to do something about it. That year changed everything about how I think about overhead. I want to stay on the new hire piece for a moment because I think it's one of the most underappreciated overhead miscalculations in growing construction companies, and almost nobody talks about it explicitly. When you hire to support growth, the instinct is to project that person at full capacity for the full year. You know what you're paying them. You know what a fully productive person in that role should generate. So you plug that number into the model and you move on. But that math only works if they're actually fully productive immediately. And in construction, especially in production and operations roles, that almost never happens. Think about what it takes to actually bring somebody new into a construction company and get them performing at full capacity. They need to learn your estimating standards, your subcontractor relationships, your client communication expectations, your quality benchmarks, your scheduling rhythm, your approval process, your software, and your culture. And they need to do it all while simultaneously trying to contribute to live projects with real clients and real deadlines. That ramp takes time. For most production roles in a growing construction company, a realistic ramp to full productivity is probably 6 to 12 months. And during that ramp, you're not getting the output that you projected. You're getting something closer to half and sometimes less. Now, layer the second cost on top of that. While the new hire is ramping, somebody experienced is carrying them. A senior project manager is answering their questions. A lead supervisor is double checking their work. Your best people are doing their own jobs, plus adding the mentoring load of bringing somebody new up to speed. That reduces their output too. Maybe not by half, but meaningfully. So, a single new hire doesn't just add one half productive person to the model, they temporarily reduce the output of at least one of your fully productive people while they ramp. When you hire three or four people at once in anticipation of a big growth year, which is exactly what we did, the compounding effect is significant. And if your financial projections assumed full productivity from all of them, the gap between the projected and the actual output can be enormous. The fix isn't to stop hiring. Growth requires people. The fix is to build the ramp into the model honestly. If you're bringing on three production staff in the first quarter, assume 50% productivity through the second quarter at a minimum. Adjust your revenue projection accordingly, and make sure that the overhead that you're committing to reflects what the business can realistically produce during that ramp period, not what it will eventually produce once everyone is fully up to speed. This also changes the way that you think about the timing of new hires. Hiring in anticipation of work is high risk because you're adding overhead before the revenue exists to support it. Hiring when the work is already proven and the training load is manageable is lower risk because the ramp period is funded by existing production rather than by projected future revenue. The most expensive version of this mistake is hiring an entirely new layer of staff in quarter one, projecting them at full capacity, building your overhead budget around that assumption, and then watching the first half of the year underperform while the overhead runs at full pace. That's not a hiring mistake, that's a planning mistake. And it's entirely preventable if you build the ramp into the model before you commit. So, how do you actually build an overhead budget that reflects reality instead of ambition? The process that I use starts not with expenses, but with revenue. Before you build an overhead budget, you need a revenue projection that you actually believe, not your hope for it number, not the number that would make your year feel like a success, your honest number, the one built from your current backlog, your pipeline conversion rate, and your realistic assessment of what the team can produce given who's on it and where they're at in their development. That revenue number then becomes the anchor for everything else. Once you have it, you allocate overhead as a percentage of the projected revenue across your expense categories. You look at what you actually spent in each category last year. You adjust for known changes, new hires, new spaces, new commitments that you've already made, and you arrive at a budget that is proportional to the revenue that you expect to produce. The discipline here is resisting the urge to build the overhead budget for the company that you want rather than the company that you already have. It's tempting to project strong and spend strong, but overhead committed today has to be converted to revenue by delivering it tomorrow. If the revenue doesn't show up at the projected level, the overhead doesn't go away. The second layer of this, and the one that makes the model genuinely useful rather than just a spreadsheet exercise, is running the analysis separately for each division of your business. Because different parts of your business have completely different overhead intensities. A design operation with specialized staff, dedicated software, and significant non billable administrative time carries a lot different overhead per dollar of revenue than a field crew operation. The general contractor management layer that oversees multiple projects has different fixed cost commitments than a self performing crew. If you blend all of those together into one overhead number and apply a single markup across the board, you will systematically misprice work that is heavy on one division and light on another. And with the added pressure of hitting a markup number that is acceptable in your area, you may end up pricing yourself out of work or, even worse, into work that you never should have accepted in the first place. Running the overhead model by division lets you see what markup each part of the business actually needs to cover its own costs and produce a real profit. And once you have that, your pricing becomes specific to the work, not just a company wide average applied uniformly to every job, regardless of what it actually requires. For builders who aren't yet running multiple formal divisions, the principle still applies at a simpler level. At minimum, separate your truly fixed overhead from your variable and discretionary overhead. Know which expenses run regardless of revenue and which ones you can influence. That knowledge alone gives you more control than most builders have. Before I go further, I want to stop and address something that trips up a lot of builders when they start working with these numbers, and that's the difference between markup and margin. These two terms get used interchangeably in construction all the time. They are not the same thing, and confusing them is how builders consistently underprice their work without realizing it. Markup is calculated on cost. It's the multiplier you apply to your jobs to arrive at your selling price. If your job costs are $100,000 and you apply a 1.25 markup, your price is $125,000. Margin is calculated on revenue. It's the percentage of your selling price that covers overhead and profit. On that same $125,000 project, your $25,000 of overhead and profit actually represents a 20% margin. Same dollars, different math. And the difference matters more than most people realize. Here's where it gets dangerous in practice. A builder decides that they want a 20% margin on their work. That sounds reasonable, but they calculate it as a 20% markup, meaning that they take their job costs and add 20% on top. What they've actually created is not a 20% margin, it's a 16.7% margin. That gap, 3.3 percentage points, might not sound significant on a single job, but when you run it across $2 or $3 million in annual revenue, you're looking at $60 to $100,000 in profit that you thought you were making that you aren't. Let me give you the numbers that actually matter for this conversation. A 1.2 times markup produces a 16.7% margin. 1.25 produces 20% margin. 1.5 produces a 33.3% margin. 1.77 produces a 43.5% margin. And a 2 times markup produces 50% margin. Notice that to achieve a 20% margin, you need 1.25 markup, not 1.2. That distinction matters every single time you price a job. When I talk about the markup multiplier that comes out of the overhead model, I'm talking about markup on job costs. That's the number your overhead projection produces. How many dollars of revenue you need for every dollar of job costs to cover overhead and hit your profit target. When somebody in your market tells you that they work on a 20% margin, ask yourself whether they mean markup or margin, because if they're calculating it as markup when they mean margin, they're working on a thinner number than they think they are, and so is everybody else that's benchmarking against them. The builders who understand this distinction price with precision. The ones who don't are often working harder than their numbers suggest they need to, and wondering why their profit never quite lands where they expected. Now that we fully understand the difference in markup and margin, how do we make sure that we're actually making the money that we want to? Building an honest overhead budget is the first half of the system. The second half is monitoring it consistently enough that you can act on it before it's too late to change the outcome. This is exactly what we didn't do in our year 5. We had a plan, we just weren't watching it closely enough to catch it when reality started diverging from it. What we built afterwards is a 3-tiered monitoring system. Each tier has a different cadence and a different purpose. Together, they convert overhead from a historical record into a forward thinking management tool. The first tier is monthly expense accountability. Every month, we do an estimated versus actual expense review with those who manage budgets. This is not a passive report, it's an active conversation. Budget owners are expected to know where they stand against their monthly allocation and explain any meaningful variance as well as flag anything that looks like it's trending in the wrong direction. The goal of the monthly review is simple: catch overspending before it compounds. A single month of running over in a category is manageable. 3 months of running over in the same category unaddressed is a problem that will show up painfully at the end of the year. This also changes the relationship budget owners have with their expenses. When somebody knows that they're going to sit across from you every month and account for their numbers, they pay attention to their numbers significantly more. The accountability is then built into the system. The second tier is quarterly revenue performance by division. Every quarter, we do a revenue performance review across all internal divisions. The questions we're asking is not whether total revenue is on track, we're asking whether each part of the business is actually pulling its weight. Did the design team bill enough labor hours to cover their overhead and contribute to the overall model? Did the field crew hit their production target? Did the production management layer generate enough billable supervision to justify their costs? And did the GC layer hit their overall revenue goal? This division level view matters because a company can look roughly on track at the top line while one division is quietly underperforming. The top line number masks it, and the divisional breakdown surfaces it. So, surfacing it quarterly means you have time to respond. You can redirect resources, you can adjust workload, you can have honest conversations about whether a particular part of the business is performing at the level that the model requires. None of that is possible if you're only looking at the numbers once a year. The third and final tier is the formal mid year adjustment. A mid year review is the most important of all three of these tiers because after 2 full quarters of data, you have enough information to make a real assessment of how the year is going to finish. If quarter 1 and 2 performed at or above your plan, you stay the course. If they underperformed, this is the moment where optimism has to give way to math. Budget owners need to come to their mid year review with a clear picture of where they stand and, if we're behind, a specific set of discretionary expenses that they can reduce to close that gap. This is where the distinction between fixed, variable, and discretionary overhead becomes actionable. You can't cut rent mid year. You can't reduce payroll without significant pain, but you can pause education and training programs. You can cut entertainment budgets. You can defer dues and subscriptions that aren't critical to operations. None of these individual will save a year that has gone badly off track, but together they can meaningfully reduce the damage while you focus on accelerating production in the second half. The discipline that this requires is honesty. The mid-year review only works if people in the room are willing to say plainly and honestly that the plan isn't working and that these very specific things need to change. That's a harder conversation than staying optimistic and hoping that the second half saves you. I know this because I've chosen optimism more than once, and the cost of that choice is a year of profitability. The 3-tier rhythm is the structural answer to that mistake, not because it eliminates bad years, nothing does that, but because it ensures that when a bad year is forming, you see it early enough to do something about it. Here's what I hope you take away from this episode. Overhead is not the enemy. Unmonitored overhead is. A business that understands its overhead structure, allocates it intentionally against a realistic revenue projection, and monitors it monthly against actual performance is a business that can make real decisions, not just reactive ones, not optimistic ones, real ones about when to hire, when to hold, when to push, and when to pull back. And a business that knows the difference between markup and margin is a business that prices with precision instead of with hope. Because the gap between what you think margin is and what it actually is, that gap shows up at the end of the year every single time. A 3-tiered monitoring system isn't bureaucracy. It isn't corporate overhead for the sake of process. It's the structural difference between managing the business and being managed by it. We lost a year of profitability learning that lesson. Not because we weren't working hard, not because the market failed us, but because we built the overhead structure of a bigger company before we had fully earned the right to carry it. And we weren't watching closely enough to catch it while there was still time to act. That lesson was expensive, but it produced the systems that we run today. And that system is what allows us to grow with intention instead of growing with hope. In the next episode, we're going to bring everything back from the series and put it together into something that I think is the most practically useful conversation we've had yet. Pricing for profit, not just survival. You now understand job costs, you understand overhead, you understand the difference between markup and margin. The next question is how to combine all of that into a pricing model that produces real, predictable profit, not just revenue that looks impressive until December. Thanks for listening to Breakonomics, and I'll see you in the next one.